What really happened in America's history? Colonial America. Foundations of a Republic 1607 to 1763 in the early years of the 17th century. A new world waited beyond the horizon. Vast, wild, and untamed. To the empires of Europe, it was not a home, but a prize. But to a few brave souls, it would become something far greater, the birthplace of a new kind of civilization. In 1607, English settlers arrived on the banks of the James River in Virginia. They named their settlement Jamestown, and with it, the story of America truly began. They came seeking wealth and opportunity, but what they found was hardship. The swamps brought disease, the winters brought hunger, and the soil brought no gold. Of the first 104 settlers, barely a third survived the first year. And yet, Jamestown endured not through fortune, but through adaptation. When John Rolfe introduced tobacco cultivation, the colony found its lifeline. The plant became Virginia's brown gold, a crop that would fuel both prosperity and dependence, and lay the foundation of an economy built on labor, land, and slavery. While the South grew from plantations and profit, the North was born of faith. In 1620, a small ship called the Mayflower landed far to the north at Plymouth Rock. On board were the Pilgrims' men and women who fled religious persecution in England to build a community where conscience could be free. Before setting foot on shore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, a simple, radical promise: government by consent of the governed. In that fragile covenant, scratched onto paper aboard a storm-tossed ship, lay the seed of American self-rule. In the decades that followed, English colonies spread along the Atlantic coast, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, and the Carolinas. Each was unique, some founded for profit, others for faith, and some, like Pennsylvania under William Penn, for tolerance itself. The New England colonies built towns, schools, and churches. The middle colonies thrived on trade and diversity. The southern colonies prospered on plantations, growing rice, indigo, and tobacco. But while settlers carved farms and cities from the wilderness, another people already called this land home. Native nations, the Powhatan, the Wampanoag, the Iroquois, and many more, had lived here for thousands of years. To them, the newcomers were not pioneers, but invaders. Trade brought moments of peace. Disease and expansion brought endless conflict. Over time, the native presence would shrink under the relentless push of European settlement, a tragedy that would echo through centuries of American growth. By the mid-1600s, the colonies were no longer fragile outposts. They had become societies self-sufficient, independent, and ambitious. Each colony had its own assembly, its own militia, and its own laws. While they still swore loyalty to the English crown, they had already begun to govern themselves. Distance bred independence, and independence bred identity. But in the pursuit of prosperity, a darker chapter unfolded. In 1619, the first African captives arrived in Virginia aboard an English privateer. They were traded as property, beginning the transatlantic system of slavery that would stain America's conscience for generations. The same year, the House of Burgesses met for the first time, establishing representative government in the New World. In that single summer, freedom and bondage entered American life side by side. The paradox of liberty in a land of chains had begun. Throughout the 17th century, the colonies weathered war, rebellion, and reform. In New England, the Puritan dream fractured under intolerance and fear, culminating in the Salem witch trials, a haunting symbol of zeal turned tyranny. In Virginia, Bacon's rebellion revealed tensions between settlers and governors, poor and rich, frontier and power. And in every colony, the struggle to balance authority and autonomy became part of everyday life. As the 18th century dawned, the colonies flourished. Populations grew rapidly from a few thousand to over 1 million by mid-century. Cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became centers of commerce and ideas. A new generation of colonists emerged, born not in England, but in America. Their loyalties were divided. their accent already different. They were English in heritage, but something else in spirit. The Great Awakening swept across the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, igniting faith and emotion in towns and fields alike. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield declared that salvation was personal, not controlled by kings or clergy. The movement did more than change religion. It awakened the idea that authority could be questioned, that every individual had worth. In revival tents and rural churches, the language of spiritual freedom prepared the way for political freedom. Yet, for all their independence, the colonies still existed under the shadow of empire. Across the Atlantic, Britain saw its American subjects as both resource and revenue. Trade laws bound the colonies to the crown. Taxes and tariffs enriched London's coffers. But the colonies had grown restless, accustomed to running their own affairs. When Britain and France clashed in the French and Indian War 1754-1763, the colonies fought alongside the British. It was a war for control of North America, for land, trade, and destiny. Though victory brought Britain vast new territories, it also brought staggering debt. And in London, the king's ministers turned once again to the colonies for payment. The taxes that followed would ignite outrage. The acts, the boycotts, the protests, all of it lay ahead. But in truth, the revolution had already begun long before the first musket fired. It began in the soil of Jamestown, in the Covenant of Plymouth, in the assemblies that governed without kings, and in the hearts of those who believed that liberty was their birthright. For over 150 years, the colonies had lived as apprentices of freedom. They had struggled, adapted, rebelled, and survived. And when the time came to stand against the empire that had created them, they were ready, not by accident, but by experience. The story of colonial America is not just the story of survival, it is the story of transformation. 13 scattered settlements had grown into a people resilient, diverse, and defiant. They were still subjects of the British Crown, but in spirit they had already become something else. Americans. America's War for Independence 1763-1783. When the guns of the French and Indian War fell silent in 1763, the map of North America had changed, and so had its destiny. Britain now ruled from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, its empire larger than ever before. But victory came with a price. The war had cost Britain dearly, and the government in London looked westward for repayment. The colonies, once allies in war, were now seen as subjects to be taxed. It began quietly, with laws and paperwork. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, taxing printed documents, newspapers, even playing cards. To London, it was a modest fee. To the colonists, it was an insult. Taxation without representation. An act imposed by a parliament where no American voice was heard. Crowds filled the streets of Boston and New York. Effigies of tax collectors burned. From protest came organization, and from organization, resistance. The Sons of Liberty were born, ordinary men standing against imperial power. Under pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but the damage was done. The bond of trust between Britain and her colonies had begun to fray, and the king's ministers, proud and unbending, would not let go of control. In 1767 came the Townshend Acts, taxing goods like glass, tea, and paper. British troops landed in Boston to enforce order, redcoats in the streets of an English-speaking city. Tensions turned to violence on a cold March night in 1770. Snowballs and insults gave way to musket fire. 5 colonists lay dead. The incident would be remembered as the Boston Massacre, a name chosen not for accuracy, but for impact. The revolution was no longer an idea whispered in taverns. It was alive in the hearts of the people. 3 years later, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting a monopoly to the British East India Company. To the colonists, it was yet another sign of tyranny. On a winter night in Boston Harbor, Men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of British tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party became a symbol. Defiance brewed in rebellion. The Crown struck back with fury. The coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, punished Massachusetts by closing Boston's port, revoking its charter, and placing it under military rule. The message was clear: submission or suppression. But instead of fear, the colonies found unity. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, the first time America spoke with one voice. They petitioned the king for redress, not revolution. They still called themselves loyal subjects. But history had already moved beyond loyalty. When British troops marched on Concord in April 1775 to seize colonial weapons, local militia stood in their path at Lexington Green. No one knows who fired the first shot, but that single crack of a musket echoed across the world. The American Revolution had begun. From farmhouses and workshops, volunteers flooded to Boston. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and teachers. But they fought with purpose. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, they stood against British regulars and proved that courage could match training. Though forced to retreat, they inflicted heavy losses and gained something far greater: belief. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia once more. This time, they raised an army, and at its head they placed a man of resolve and restraint, George Washington of Virginia. Tall, silent, and composed, Washington united the colonies under one command. He inherited not an army, but a cause. For more than a year, the colonies fought without declaring independence. Many hoped for reconciliation. But the king's answer was clear. He declared them in open rebellion. Then, in 1776, a pamphlet appeared, written by a man named Thomas Paine. It was called Common Sense. In fiery, simple language, it told Americans what they already knew in their hearts: that the time for petitions was over, and the time for independence had come. "'Tis time to part," Paine wrote, and America listened. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress approved a document drafted by Thomas Jefferson, declaring that all men are created equal, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that when government becomes destructive of liberty, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. It was the Declaration of Independence, both a statement of principle and a declaration of war. The British Empire, the most powerful in the world, now faced rebellion from its own colonies. Washington's army was outnumbered, undertrained, and ill-equipped. Yet they fought with a power that came not from weapons, but from will. The war began with disaster. In 1776, British forces invaded New York, driving Washington's army into retreat across New Jersey. Winter came. The revolution seemed lost. But in that darkest season, Washington struck back. On Christmas night, 1776, he crossed the icy Delaware River and surprised a garrison of Hessian soldiers at Trenton. It was a small victory, but it revived the spirit of the Revolution. Over the next year, the war spread across the continent. In 1777, American forces under General Horatio Gates achieved a stunning victory at Saratoga, capturing an entire British army. The triumph convinced France to join the war on America's side. With French ships and soldiers, the revolution became a global conflict. Still, the struggle dragged on. In the winter of 1777 to 78, Washington's army suffered at Valley Forge, hungry, cold, and desperate. But under the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, the ragged volunteers became a disciplined force. Out of suffering came strength. In the South, the war turned brutal. Civilians were caught between loyalists and patriots. Cities were burned, families divided. But from the chaos rose heroes: Nathaniel Greene, Francis Marion, and countless unnamed fighters who waged a war of endurance. By 1781, the end drew near. British General Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia. Washington saw his chance. With French troops under Rochambeau and the French fleet blocking escape by sea, the Americans laid siege to Yorktown. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered. On October 19, 1781, the War for Independence was won. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris made it official. Britain recognized the United States of America as a free and independent nation. The Revolution was over, but its meaning was only beginning. It had created not just a country, but an idea that liberty belonged to the people, not the crown. That government existed to serve, not to rule. The cost was immense. Over 25,000 Americans had died. Cities were burned, families torn apart. Yet, in that sacrifice, the world saw something new. A republic born not of bloodline, but of belief. As George Washington stood before his soldiers and resigned his command, he set the final example that true power rests not in those who hold it, but in those willing to give it up. The American Revolution did not end in triumphalism. It ended in humility, in the hope that liberty, once won, could be preserved. The world had seen kings rise and empires fall. Now, it would see if freedom itself could endure. The colonies were no more. The United States had been born, but the true test of the Revolution to govern by the will of the people was still to come. The Federalist experiment, building a nation 1783 to 1797, the War for Independence was over. But victory brought not peace, only questions. The soldiers who had fought for liberty now returned to a country without direction, without stability, and without a king. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris made it official. Britain recognized the United States of America as a free and independent nation. But what did that freedom mean? 13 colonies had become 13 states, independent in name, united in war, but divided in purpose. The Revolution had overthrown tyranny. Now the harder task began: how to replace it with order. The nation's first government, born during the war, was called the Articles of Confederation. It was a government built on fear of centralized power, fear of another monarchy, fear of losing the liberty so painfully won. Under the Articles, each state kept its sovereignty. Congress could declare war and sign treaties, but it could not tax, regulate trade, or enforce its laws. It could request money, but not demand it. It could raise armies, but not sustain them. At first, the arrangements seemed noble: freedom from control, independence preserved. But independence without unity soon became chaos. The economy collapsed. The national debt soared. States quarreled over borders and currencies. Merchants faced tariffs not from foreign nations, but from neighboring states. To foreign powers, the United States looked like an experiment already failing. Britain refused to withdraw its troops from frontier forts. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade. The dream of liberty hung by a thread. Then, in 1786, that dream nearly died. In Massachusetts, farmers faced crushing debts and foreclosures. Many were veterans, men who had fought for freedom and now lost their homes to the very government they had defended. Led by a former soldier named Daniel Shays, they rose in protest, seizing courthouses and demanding relief. The rebellion was quickly crushed, but it sent a message louder than any musket. Liberty without order was anarchy, and if the nation could not govern itself, it would not survive. From that chaos came resolve. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. They gathered in Independence Hall, the same room where they had declared independence 11 years before. Among them stood George Washington, the reluctant hero now presiding in silence. Benjamin Franklin, the aging philosopher. James Madison, the scholar with a plan. And Alexander Hamilton, the visionary who believed the nation needed strength as well as freedom. The men quickly realized that revision would not be enough. They were not there to patch the old system, they were there to build a new one. Behind closed doors, in secrecy and heat, they debated for months. Large states demanded representation by population. Small states feared domination. The Great Compromise gave the new government two houses, one by population, the House of Representatives, and one with equal votes for every state, the Senate. But the greatest debate was over power itself. How to prevent tyranny without descending into weakness. The answer became the Constitution of the United States, a framework that divided authority between three branches: a legislative to make the laws, an executive to enforce them, and a judiciary to interpret them. Each would check and balance the others. No one branch and no one man would rule alone. But the Constitution was not perfect. To keep the South in union, it allowed slavery to persist, even counting the enslaved as 3/5 of a person for representation. The same document that declared liberty for all men also preserved bondage for millions. It was a moral compromise that would haunt the Republic for generations. When the delegates signed the Constitution on September 17, 1787, Benjamin Franklin looked out over the chamber and saw the carving of a sun on the president's chair. He said quietly, "I have often wondered whether that sun was rising or setting. Now I know it is a rising sun." The Constitution still had to be ratified by the states. Debate raged across the new nation. Those who supported it called themselves Federalists, men like Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, who argued that a strong central government was essential to preserve the Union. Those who opposed it, the Anti-Federalists, feared it would replace one tyranny with another. To win the people's trust, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote a series of essays, the Federalist Papers, explaining the new Constitution. In them, Madison warned that liberty could only survive if power was divided and ambition balanced ambition. By 1788, enough states had ratified the Constitution. The experiment would begin. The next question was, who would lead it? There was only one answer: the man who had led the revolution, the man who had refused a crown, George Washington. In 1789, he was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. When he took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, the crowd below wept. For the first time in modern history, a republic had chosen its leader through peace, not blood. Washington's presidency would define the tone and traditions of the new nation. He built a cabinet with Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. At that table sat two visions of America's future. Hamilton envisioned a nation of commerce, cities, and strong government tied together by finance and trade. Jefferson imagined a republic of farmers, simple and self-reliant, bound by local freedom and virtue. Their conflict would shape the first political divide: Federalist versus Republican, unity versus liberty. Hamilton's economic plan gave the new government credit, stability, and purpose. But it also gave rise to opposition, fear, and the birth of factions, the very thing Washington dreaded most. Even as the nation struggled to find balance, Washington set a precedent that would define the republic's character. When rebels in Pennsylvania rose up against a whiskey tax, he acted not as a tyrant, but as a guardian of law, leading troops to enforce order, then pardoning the guilty to restore peace. And after 2 terms, when he could have ruled for life, he stepped down voluntarily. In doing so, he performed the ultimate act of democracy, surrendering power to the people. In his farewell address, he warned against the dangers that could destroy the Union, the poison of partisanship, the lure of foreign alliances, and the corruption of public virtue. His words were not prophecy, they were instruction. By 1797, when Washington retired to Mount Vernon, the Republic had survived its infancy. The Constitution had been tested and endured. The government had collected taxes, raised armies, enforced laws, and proved that liberty could live under order. But beneath the triumph, fractures remained between regions, between classes. and between visions of what America should become. The Revolution had won independence. The Constitution had built a framework, and Washington had given it life. The Federalist experiment had succeeded, not perfectly, but miraculously. For the first time, power did not descend from kings or conquerors, but from citizens and laws. The Republic stood. The world watched in awe and in doubt. Could freedom truly govern itself? For now, the answer was yes. But the true test of unity, equality, and endurance was yet to come. Adams and Jefferson, The Crisis of Freedom, 1797 to 1801. When George Washington left the presidency in 1797, the world watched in disbelief. For the first time in history, the most powerful man in a nation stepped down willingly, not to a rival, not to a monarch, but to the will of the people. But Washington's departure left behind something he had feared most: division. The unity of the Revolution was fading, replaced by parties, passions, and politics. The United States now faced its second great experiment, the peaceful transfer of power. Two men, once brothers in revolution, now stood on opposite sides of the nation's future. John Adams of Massachusetts, Washington's vice president and a steadfast Federalist, believed in order, strength, and law. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, his old friend and now fierce rival, believed in liberty, simplicity, and the wisdom of the people. Their rivalry would define an era and nearly destroy the republic they had built together. When Adams took the oath of office as the second president of the United States, he inherited a nation both proud and precarious. The government was new, the economy uncertain, and across the Atlantic a storm was raging. In France, revolution had devoured its own children. Kings were executed, and chaos reigned. The same ideals that had once inspired America now terrified its leaders. Adams saw in the French Revolution the danger of liberty, unrestrained passion without order, freedom without discipline. But France saw something else. They saw betrayal. During the war against Britain, France had been America's ally. Now, America traded with their enemy and refused to honor old treaties. In 1797, Adams sent envoys to Paris to negotiate peace. What they found was corruption and insult. French agents known only as X, Y, and Z demanded bribes just to begin talks. When Adams revealed the scandal to Congress, outrage swept the nation. Millions for defense, Americans shouted, but not 1 cent for tribute. The XYZ affair united the country for a moment. Patriotism surged. The young republic prepared for war with its former ally. Congress built a navy, ships like the USS Constitution, old Ironsides, to defend American honor on the seas. A quasi-war erupted, a shadow conflict fought in the Caribbean between American and French vessels. But even as Adams strengthened the military, he resisted the calls for full-scale war. He was a man of conviction and restraint. He believed that liberty could not survive if consumed by fear. Yet fear was spreading, not from abroad, but from within. Federalists warned that French agents and radical sympathizers had infiltrated the nation. Jefferson's Republican press denounced the government as monarchic and corrupt. In this fevered atmosphere, Adams faced a choice: defend freedom or preserve order. In 1798, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The laws gave the president power to deport foreigners deemed dangerous and made it a crime to criticize the government. To Adams's supporters, they were a shield against subversion. To his opponents, they were a dagger at the heart of the First Amendment. Printers were arrested, newspapers silenced. In the land that had fought for free speech, words themselves had become a weapon and a crime. Jefferson and James Madison responded in secret. They drafted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, declaring that states had the right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws. It was a radical idea, one that raised an even greater question. If each state could decide what laws to follow, what bound the Union together? The crisis of freedom was not just political, it was existential. How could a republic preserve liberty and law when the two collided? As the century neared its end, the young nation stood divided between two visions of America, one of centralized strength and stability, the other of decentralized liberty and popular voice. And at the center of it all, two men, Adams and Jefferson, whose friendship had turned to rivalry, and whose rivalry would define the republic. The election of 1800 would be the most bitter in American history. Pamphlets and newspapers filled the streets with slander. Federalists warned that Jefferson's victory would bring chaos, atheism, and anarchy. Republicans accused Adams of monarchy and oppression. The campaign tore the country apart. And yet, it was democracy in motion. For the first time, Americans were not choosing a king. They were choosing between competing visions of their future. When the votes were counted, the results stunned the nation. It was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr. The Constitution gave no clear procedure for such a deadlock. For days, the election hung in the balance. The decision passed to the House of Representatives, where Federalists still held sway. Ballot after ballot failed to produce a winner. Outside, rumors spread of militias preparing to march of revolution, returning to American soil. Then, in a moment of quiet irony, Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's old rival and Adams's own Federalist ally, broke the deadlock. He urged his party to choose Jefferson. "Better a wrong-headed philosopher than a dangerous opportunist," Hamilton said of Burr. On the 36th ballot, Thomas Jefferson was elected the third president of the United States. And so, power passed not by sword or decree, but by vote, peacefully, legally. For the first time in human history, a nation had changed its rulers without bloodshed. In that moment, the republic proved its strength not through force, but through faith in its own design. John Adams, humiliated and heartbroken, left the Capitol before dawn on the morning of Jefferson's inauguration. He was the first president to lose power and the first to honor the transfer of it. When Jefferson took the oath of office on March 4, 1801, he spoke not as a conqueror, but as a healer. "We are all Federalists," he said. "We are all Republicans." It was a call for unity and a promise that liberty and order could coexist. The crisis of freedom had nearly undone the Revolution. But in surviving it, America had proven something extraordinary. That its government was not the rule of men, but of laws. That power could change hands without the nation collapsing. That democracy, though fragile, could endure its own passions. The Revolution had given America independence. The Federalist era had given it structure, and now, through conflict and compromise, it had given the world something even greater: the first peaceful transfer of power in modern history. The Republic had survived its first storm, but the winds of change were only beginning to rise. Ahead lay new frontiers, new faith and new contradictions, and a man whose vision would push the nation beyond its limits. Thomas Jefferson's America was about to begin. Adams and Jefferson, The Crisis of Freedom, 1797 to 1801. When George Washington left the presidency in 1797, the world watched in disbelief. For the first time in history, the most powerful man in a nation stepped down willingly, not to a rival, not to a monarch, but to the will of the people. But Washington's departure left behind something he had feared most: division. The unity of the Revolution was fading, replaced by parties, passions, and politics. The United States now faced its second great experiment: the peaceful transfer of power. Two men, once brothers in revolution, now stood on opposite sides of the nation's future. John Adams of Massachusetts, Washington's vice president and a steadfast Federalist, believed in order, strength, and law. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, his old friend and now fierce rival, believed in liberty, simplicity, and the wisdom of the people. Their rivalry would define an era and nearly destroy the republic they had built together. When Adams took the oath of office as the second president of the United States, he inherited a nation both proud and precarious. The government was new, the economy uncertain, And across the Atlantic, a storm was raging. In France, revolution had devoured its own children. Kings were executed, and chaos reigned. The same ideals that had once inspired America now terrified its leaders. Adams saw in the French Revolution the danger of liberty, unrestrained passion without order, freedom without discipline. But France saw something else. They saw betrayal. During the war against Britain, France had been America's ally. Now, America traded with their enemy and refused to honor old treaties. In 1797, Adams sent envoys to Paris to negotiate peace. What they found was corruption and insult. French agents, known only as X, Y, and Z, demanded bribes just to begin talks. When Adams revealed the scandal to Congress, outrage swept the nation. Millions for defense, Americans shouted, but not 1 cent for tribute. The XYZ affair united the country for a moment. Patriotism surged. The young republic prepared for war with its former ally. Congress built a navy, ships like the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, to defend American honor on the seas. A quasi-war erupted, a shadow conflict fought in the Caribbean between American and French vessels. But even as Adams strengthened the military, he resisted the calls for full-scale war. He was a man of conviction and restraint. He believed that liberty could not survive if consumed by fear. Yet fear was spreading, not from abroad, but from within. Federalists warned that French agents and radical sympathizers had infiltrated the nation. Jefferson's Republican press denounced the government as monarchic and corrupt. In this fevered atmosphere, Adams faced a choice: defend freedom or preserve order. In 1798, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The laws gave the president power to deport foreigners deemed dangerous and made it a crime to criticize the government. To Adams's supporters, they were a shield against subversion. To his opponents, they were a dagger at the heart of the First Amendment. Printers were arrested, newspapers silenced. In the land that had fought for free speech, words themselves had become a weapon and a crime. Jefferson and James Madison responded in secret. They drafted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, declaring that states had the right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws. It was a radical idea, one that raised an even greater question. If each state could decide what laws to follow, what bound the Union together? The crisis of freedom was not just political, it was existential. How could a republic preserve liberty and law when the two collided? As the century neared its end, the young nation stood divided between two visions of America, one of centralized strength and stability, the other of decentralized liberty and popular voice. And at the center of it all, two men, Adams and Jefferson, whose friendship had turned to rivalry, and whose rivalry would define the republic. The election of 1800 would be the most bitter in American history. Pamphlets and newspapers filled the streets with slander. Federalists warned that Jefferson's victory would bring chaos, atheism, and anarchy. Republicans accused Adams of monarchy and oppression. The campaign tore the country apart. And yet, it was democracy in motion. For the first time, Americans were not choosing a king. They were choosing between competing visions of their future. When the votes were counted, the results stunned the nation. It was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr. The Constitution gave no clear procedure for such a deadlock. For days, the election hung in the balance. The decision passed to the House of Representatives, where Federalists still held sway. Ballot after ballot failed to produce a winner. Outside, rumors spread of militias preparing to march of revolution, returning to American soil. Then, in a moment of quiet irony, Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's old rival and Adams's own Federalist ally, broke the deadlock. He urged his party to choose Jefferson. "Better a wrong-headed philosopher than a dangerous opportunist," Hamilton said of Burr. On the 36th ballot, Thomas Jefferson was elected the third president of the United States. And so, power passed, not by sword or decree, but by vote, peacefully, legally. For the first time in human history, a nation had changed its rulers without bloodshed. In that moment, the Republic proved its strength not through force, but through faith in its own design. John Adams, humiliated and heartbroken, left the Capitol before dawn on the morning of Jefferson's inauguration. He was the first president to lose power and the first to honor the transfer of it. When Jefferson took the oath of office on March 4, 1801, he spoke not as a conqueror, but as a healer. "We are all Federalists," he said. "We are all Republicans." It was a call for unity and a promise that liberty and order could coexist. The crisis of freedom had nearly undone the Revolution. But in surviving it, America had proven something extraordinary. That its government was not the rule of men, but of laws. That power could change hands without the nation collapsing. That democracy, though fragile, could endure its own passions. The Revolution had given America independence. The Federalist era had given it structure, and now, through conflict and compromise, it had given the world something even greater: the first peaceful transfer of power in modern history. The Republic had survived its first storm, but the winds of change were only beginning to rise. Ahead lay new frontiers, new faith and new contradictions, and a man whose vision would push the nation beyond its limits. Thomas Jefferson's America was about to begin. The era of good feelings, America's illusion of unity, 1815 to 1825. The War of 1812 had ended not in victory or defeat, but in survival, and survival in the young Republic's eyes felt like triumph. For the first time, America had faced the fire of a global empire and endured. The Revolution had proven the right to exist. The war had proven the right to endure. As the cannons fell silent and the scars of battle began to fade, a new mood swept across the nation, a feeling of pride, purpose, and possibility. It was called the era of good feelings. But beneath that calm surface, the nation's deepest divisions were already forming. In 1817, James Monroe, a veteran of the Revolution and the last of the Founding Fathers, took the oath of office as the 5th President of the United States. He was dignified, modest, and deliberate, a bridge between the generation that had fought for independence and the generation now reaping its rewards. Monroe's America was growing in land, in confidence, and in ambition. The population had passed 9 million. New states like Indiana, Mississippi, and Illinois joined the Union. Settlers pushed westward, carving farms and towns into lands once untouched. The war had taught Americans that they were stronger together than apart. The political divisions that had once defined the early republic, Federalist versus Republican, seemed to fade. The old Federalist Party, discredited by its opposition to the war, collapsed into silence. For the first time, the United States appeared united. One nation, one voice, one people. Monroe traveled through the states, greeted everywhere with celebration. Newspapers hailed him as a symbol of peace and harmony. But even as the nation basked in its reflection, the cracks of disunity widened quietly below. Economically, the country was transforming. In the North, industry was taking root, spinning mills, ironworks, and the first sparks of mechanization. In the South, cotton reigned supreme, its profits soaring with the invention of the cotton gin, and its wealth built on the back of enslaved labor. The West, meanwhile, was booming with expansion and speculation. To bind these regions together, a new vision emerged: the American system. Championed by Henry Clay, it called for roads, canals, tariffs, and a national bank to unite commerce and communication from sea to frontier. It was an idea as grand as it was fragile, a blueprint for national unity built on compromise. But prosperity, like peace, is often an illusion. In 1819, the nation faced its first great financial crisis. Banks had lent recklessly. Land prices soared, and speculation turned to panic. When the bubble burst, thousands lost their homes and farms. Factories closed, credit vanished, and unemployment spread. The Panic of 1819 was a brutal awakening. It reminded the young nation that liberty did not guarantee stability. And as the economy faltered, another, far older conflict re-emerged, one that could no longer be ignored. As settlers poured westward, new territories petitioned for statehood. Among them was Missouri. Its request to join the Union in 1819 brought a question no law could easily answer. Would slavery be allowed in the new lands of the Republic? For decades, the issue had been buried under compromise and silence. Now it returned with fury. In the halls of Congress, the debate raged. Northern representatives denounced the spread of slavery as a betrayal of the Revolution's ideals. Southern voices warned that interference would threaten their economy and their survival. The young nation, once united under liberty, now faced the possibility of tearing itself apart. In 1820, a compromise, fragile and imperfect, was struck. Crafted by Henry Clay, it became known as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. Maine, carved from Massachusetts, would enter as a free state, preserving the balance between North and South. And henceforth, slavery would be prohibited in all future territories north of latitude 3,630. It was not a solution, but a truce. A line drawn across a map and across the soul of the nation. The crisis passed, and calm returned. But beneath that calm, the question remained unanswered. How long could a republic founded on liberty coexist with the institution of slavery? While Congress wrestled with morality, Monroe turned his gaze outward, beyond America's shores. In Latin America, revolutions flared. Nations like Mexico, Colombia, and Chile rose against Spanish rule, echoing the same cry for freedom that had once defined America itself. In Europe, monarchies sought to crush these uprisings and restore imperial control. To Monroe, this was more than a foreign matter. It was a threat to the very spirit of the New World. In 1823, he issued a declaration that would define American policy for generations, the Monroe Doctrine. It warned the old empires of Europe to stay out of the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, that the Americas were no longer to be seen as colonies, but as nations with their own destinies. In exchange, the United States would remain neutral in Europe's conflicts. Behind the bold words stood a practical truth. America's power was still small, and its fleet too weak to enforce such a doctrine. It was Britain's Royal Navy, not American arms, that ensured Europe's compliance. Yet symbolically, the message was clear. The United States had claimed its place as protector of the New World, a self-appointed guardian of independence and order. At home, a new sense of nationalism took root. Artists, writers, and teachers began to speak of an American identity, distinct from Europe. Noah Webster's dictionary gave the English language an American voice. Painters captured vast landscapes and frontier life. Education spread, and the myth of a shared American destiny began to form. It was an age of pride, but also of illusion. The era of good feelings masked deep divisions of class, region, and race. It was unity, born of exhaustion, not resolution. When James Monroe's presidency ended in 1825, the nation stood prosperous and proud. But the seeds of future conflict had already been sown. The illusion of harmony would soon give way to the reality of ambition. A new generation was rising, one less patient, more aggressive, and determined to seize the nation's destiny by force of will. Among them was a soldier from Tennessee, tough, fiery, and unafraid of power. His name was Andrew Jackson. And under his leadership, America would shed its innocence, embrace its democracy, and awaken its contradictions. The era of good feelings had promised unity. But its legacy was something more complex, a nation at peace with itself on the surface, but divided within. An illusion of harmony before the coming storm. And when that storm arrived, it would change the Republic forever. The age of Jackson and the rise of democracy, 1825 to 1830, the era of good feelings had promised unity. But unity, like peace, never lasts forever. Beneath the calm surface of Monroe's America, ambition was stirring, and with it, the first tremors of a new political age. In 1824, the illusion of harmony shattered. For men, all veterans of the Revolution's legacy vied for the presidency of the United States. John Quincy Adams, son of the second president, a scholar and statesman. Henry Clay, the eloquent Speaker of the House, champion of the American system. William Crawford of Georgia, a Jeffersonian of the old guard. And Andrew Jackson, a frontier hero, tough, unrefined, and beloved by the people. Jackson was unlike any man who had sought the presidency before him. He was born poor, orphaned in war, and shaped by hardship. He was not a thinker or a philosopher. He was a fighter. To his supporters, he was the embodiment of the American spirit, self-made, fearless, and incorruptible. To his critics, he was dangerous, a man of passion, not principle. When the votes were counted, Jackson led in both the popular and the electoral tally, but he had no majority. Under the Constitution, the decision passed to the House of Representatives. There, the fate of the presidency turned not on votes from the people, but on deals made behind closed doors. Henry Clay, eliminated from contention, used his influence to swing the House behind Adams, when John Quincy Adams became president and soon after appointed Clay as Secretary of State, the nation erupted in fury. To Jackson's followers, it was treachery. They called it a corrupt bargain. To them, the will of the people had been betrayed by political elites. And in that betrayal, a new force was born, a movement not of factions or philosophies, but of citizens. The age of Jackson had begun. John Quincy Adams, despite his brilliance and virtue, governed a country that no longer wanted what he represented. He believed in progress through education, infrastructure, and science, the government as a tool for national improvement. But to many Americans, especially on the frontier, Adams's vision seemed distant and elitist. They wanted a government that spoke their language, simple, direct, and strong. While Adams struggled to lead, Jackson and his allies built something unprecedented, a political machine fueled by passion, loyalty, and populism. They called themselves Democrats. And they carried a simple creed, that government belonged not to the privileged few, but to the people. Across the nation, Jackson's image became legend, the hero of New Orleans. Old Hickory, a man of the frontier who had defeated the British and defied the establishment. He was not polished like Adams, but he was powerful in a way no one else was, a man who made the people believe they had a voice. By 1828, the next election had become a crusade. It was the first truly modern campaign, a battle of newspapers, slogans, and symbols. Supporters organized rallies, parades, and barbecues. Jackson's portrait hung in taverns and shops, his name shouted in the streets. To his followers, he was the people's general, a man who would restore honor to the Republic. The campaign was vicious. Adams's supporters accused Jackson of murder, adultery, and tyranny. Jackson's allies called Adams corrupt, aristocratic, and un-American. Never before had politics been so personal or so passionate. But when the votes were cast, the people's verdict was clear. Andrew Jackson won by a landslide. For the first time in American history, power shifted not from one elite to another, but from the establishment to the electorate. The Revolution of 1828 was not fought with muskets, but with ballots. It was a revolution of participation, of emotion, of democracy itself. When Jackson arrived in Washington for his inauguration, tens of thousands of ordinary citizens poured into the Capitol. Farmers, mechanics, and frontiersmen, the forgotten and the poor, all came to see one of their own become president. As Jackson took the oath of office on March 4, 1829, the crowd roared. For a moment, it seemed that the Republic had been reborn, not in marble halls, but in the hearts of its people. But the celebration soon turned chaotic. Hundreds of citizens stormed the White House, crushing furniture and smashing china in a frenzy of excitement. To the elite, it was mob rule. To Jackson's followers, It was a victory of the people. From that day forward, nothing in American politics would ever be the same. The age of Jackson was more than a presidency. It was a transformation. Jackson saw himself as the guardian of the common man and the enemy of privilege. He believed that the people's will was sovereign, that the majority, not the elite, should rule. Under his leadership, political participation exploded. Property requirements for voting were abolished across most states. Turnout soared. The old system of quiet deference gave way to the noise and energy of democracy in motion. Yet with democracy came division. The same passion that empowered the people also inflamed them. Jackson's enemies accused him of abusing power, of acting more like a king than a president. His defiance of Congress and the courts would soon earn him both worship and hatred. But in these early years, the promise of democracy burned bright. Americans who had long been excluded from politics now felt the nation was theirs. Elections became not the property of elites, but the voice of the people, loud, messy, and alive. The Revolution had given freedom. The Constitution had given structure. And now, Jackson had given it voice. The young republic had entered a new phase, an age of expansion, energy, and emotion. The politics of reason had given way to the politics of passion. And in that passion, the United States discovered both its greatest strength and its greatest peril. For in empowering the people, democracy unleashed forces that no leader, not even Andrew Jackson, could fully control. The country that had once feared monarchy now faced a different question. Could liberty survive the will of the masses? As Jackson took the reins of power, his supporters believed the answer was yes. They saw in him the symbol of equality, courage, and justice. His enemies saw something darker, a man who might destroy the balance the founders had built. Either way, America was changing. The calm of the early republic was gone. In its place stood a restless, rising democracy, fierce, untamed, and determined to shape its own destiny. The age of Jackson had begun. And with it, the story of modern American politics. Manifest Destiny and the Road to the Mexican-American War, 1840 to 1848 by the 1840s. The United States had changed beyond recognition. The nation Andrew Jackson left behind was no longer a fragile republic hugging the Atlantic. It was a restless, growing power surging westward, driven by ambition, opportunity, and a belief that destiny itself was on its side. The dream of America had always been expansion, a promise written not in treaties or laws, but in the landscape itself. Vast plains, towering mountains, and distant horizons seemed to call the people onward. And they answered. From crowded ports and farms, thousands of settlers began to move west, across the Appalachians, through the frontier, and beyond. They traveled by wagon, horseback, and foot, families chasing the hope of new land and a better life. Each step westward carried them deeper into the unknown and closer to a destiny that would define a continent. The spirit of the age had a name: Manifest Destiny. Coined in 1845, the phrase captured a conviction that had long burned in the American soul that the United States was chosen by Providence to expand its freedom across the continent. To its believers, it was not conquest, but divine mission, the spread of democracy, civilization, and God's will. To its critics, it was arrogance, an excuse for empire disguised as virtue. But for those living it, Manifest Destiny was real, a force as powerful as any army or law. It was the American faith made manifest in motion. The first great test of that faith came in the vast lands of the Southwest, in a region called Texas. Once part of the Spanish Empire, Texas had passed into Mexican control after Mexico's independence in 1821. To populate its northern frontier, the Mexican government invited American settlers to farm its lands under one condition: they would become Mexican citizens and obey Mexican law. But the settlers who came, led by men like Stephen F. Austin, brought more than plows and dreams. They brought slaves, Protestant faith, and the American idea of independence. Tensions between the settlers and Mexican authorities soon turned to rebellion. In 1836, Texas declared itself independent. The war that followed was short, bloody, and legendary. At a mission called the Alamo, a few hundred Texans, including William Travis, James Bowie, and Davy Crockett, made their stand against thousands of Mexican troops under General Santa Anna. For 13 days they held, until the walls were breached and every defender slain. Their sacrifice became rallying cry and myth. Remember the Alamo. Soon after, under Sam Houston, the Texans struck back at the Battle of San Jacinto, capturing Santa Anna and forcing him to recognize Texas independence. The Republic of Texas was born, a nation forged in rebellion, with its own flag, its own government, and a burning desire to join the United States. But annexation was not simple. To admit Texas meant admitting a vast slaveholding territory and reigniting the sectional conflict that had long divided North and South. For nearly a decade, presidents hesitated, fearing that Texas would tear the Union apart. Then, in 1844, a new leader rose to power, a man of determination and quiet intensity. James K. Polk, a protege of Andrew Jackson, promised expansion, not someday, but now. Under his leadership, America would not only annex Texas, but claim Oregon, California, and everything in between. He was called Young Hickory, and like Jackson, he believed in action over words. Polk's election in 1844 was a mandate for manifest destiny, and he wasted no time fulfilling it. In 1845, Texas joined the Union, and Mexico, furious at what it saw as a theft of its territory, broke diplomatic relations. Polk then turned his gaze westward, offering to purchase California and New Mexico. Mexico refused. Determined, Polk sent troops under General Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande and to territory claimed by both nations. In April 1846, Mexican soldiers clashed with American patrols. Polk seized the moment. He declared that Mexico had shed American blood upon American soil. Congress voted for war. Thus began the Mexican-American War, a conflict born of ambition, pride, and the dream of empire. The war unfolded across two great fronts. In the north, Zachary Taylor led American forces into northern Mexico, winning decisive victories at Monterrey and Buena Vista, where his outnumbered troops repelled a massive Mexican assault. His cool courage made him a hero and a future president. In the west, U.S. forces seized New Mexico and California. Their settlers, led by John C. Fremont, declared the short-lived Bear Flag Republic, raising the American flag over Sonoma before the U.S. Navy arrived to claim the coast. Meanwhile, in the south, another army, led by General Winfield Scott, landed at Veracruz in 1847. From there, Scott marched inland, retracing the path of Hernan Cortes centuries before. His troops fought through Cerro Gordo, Contreras, Churubusco, and Chapultepec, where young Mexican cadets, the Niños Heroes, leaped from the fortress walls rather than surrender. On September 14, 1847, American soldiers entered Mexico City. The capital of Mexico had fallen. The war was over, but victory brought unease. Critics like Henry David Thoreau and Abraham Lincoln condemned the war as unjust, waged for the expansion of slavery under the guise of destiny. It was, Thoreau wrote, a war for conquest, not defense, but for Polk and his supporters, the outcome was triumph. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war. Mexico ceded more than half its territory, modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In return, the United States paid $15 million, the same sum Jefferson had once paid for Louisiana. In less than 50 years, the United States had grown from 13 colonies to a continental power. The dream of manifest destiny had been fulfilled from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But the victory carried a curse. For every mile of land gained, the question of slavery returned stronger than before. Would the new territories be free or slave? The balance of the Union hung by a thread. as settlers rushed west as gold was discovered in California. And as ambition turned to greed, the nation that called itself chosen began to question its own soul. Manifest destiny had made America mighty, but also divided. It had extended liberty's reach, but deepened its contradictions. And while the flag now flew from ocean to ocean, the unity beneath it was beginning to tear. For in fulfilling its destiny, America had awoken forces that would soon threaten to destroy it. The conquest of Mexico had given the nation everything it desired, except peace. The frontier had been claimed. Now, the battle for the nation's future would begin, not against foreign armies, but within its own borders.